It's the Let's Talk Polyamory podcast, where we talk about all things consensual non-monogamy, polyamory, open relationships, swinging, and how you can have secure and sexy relationships, no matter how you do them. Now here's your hosts, Tara and Andre. Hey, Andre.
Hey, Tara. Hello, everyone.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Let's Talk Polyamory podcast with Tara and Andre. Before we jump into today's awesome topic, a little bit of introduction for those of you who don't know us. I am Tara Lynn Franco, and I am a relationship and awesomeness.
And I'm Andre Turcott. I'm a sex-positive registered psychotherapist and coach.
And together we are co-founders of the online community Let's Talk Polyamory and co-creators of the digital course Poly Newbies and some other awesome things. Our passion is to help you create healthy and secure non-monogamous relationships and navigate all those rough bits that tend to come up from time to time. And also, like today, we like to talk about broader topics around relationships, sexuality, identity, and inclusion. So that brings us to today's episode, which is all about polyamory and transgender inclusion, visibility, and allyship.
Yeah, so today is March 31st, and it is the International Transgender Day of Visibility. And it is a day of global recognition, celebrating the accomplishments and victories of trans and non-binary people, while also raising the awareness of the work still needed to be done to ensure the equity, dignity, and respect of trans people everywhere. I think it's more important now than ever.
Absolutely, it is. And so I love that we're able to do a podcast on this specific topic. So why are we talking about this? So we are allies. I would consider myself an ally, and I know you would too, Andre. We are not trans individuals, and we're sharing today from our perspective as polyamory educators and advocates. And we also both have trans men and women in our lives that are important to us, and so it's close to home as well. So we're not experts, but we believe in trans rights and human rights. So that's why we're here today.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, Tara, it's interesting. I feel so many different emotions at this very moment. I'm excited to be talking about this. I'm a little intimidated given the climate. I'm concerned. And I must admit, I'm not so very hopeful. I see it as a very dark cloud on the horizon at the moment. But because of that, I think that is one of the reasons why it is so very important that we and others continue to have conversations about this, to have dialogue about this.
Yeah, and so that's what we're here to start off, but we encourage you to seek out and uplift trans voices. I think it's really easy to say that it doesn't concern me or affect me, even if you don't know trans people, but it does. And as a people and as humans, I think it's important to stand up for people's rights and allow them to be the people that they want to be. Some people are like, I don't have to worry about it. I can be who I am. But for a lot of people, that's not the case. And it's getting worse, like you said.
You know, that was very much the sentiment in the 1930s in Europe when Hitler came to power. And they said, well, it doesn't really affect me. You know, it's just a lot of rhetoric. I don't really see it as much of a threat. And then things started to happen. And then people might say, well, I'm not Jewish. It doesn't really affect me. But it does affect you. It affects all of us. It is the quality of life for all of us. We cannot simply turn a blind eye or remain silent where our brothers and sisters are being trampled on. They'll come for us next. They'll come for you.
Yeah, absolutely. So today we're going to cover why visibility matters. We talked a bit about that already. Some definitions, talk about being polyamorous and identity in relationships and how we can make polyamorous spaces more inclusive, talk a bit about this backlash. We have some specific examples that we can share and talk about, most importantly, how we can be a better ally. So let's start with why visibility matters. So did you want to jump in or shall I?
Well, sure. Okay. I'll talk about representation and belonging. Seeing trans and non-binary individuals in the media, the workplace, and communities helps others feel less alone and validates their experience and identities.
Absolutely. There's safety and legal protections, and that's why visibility is important. Visibility helps push for better laws and policies that protect trans rights and create safer spaces.
More than ever. And not only are those rights being taken away, but there are now laws and policies being enacted that will prevent those expressions and prevent future expressions. Also, mental health and well-being. Being seen and affirmed reduces the anxiety, depression, and feelings of isolation and potential desires of suicide. One quick note here in the American Journal of Preventive Medicine indicates that more than 40% of people who identify are trans are likely to commit or attempt suicide. That far outpaces the numbers of other people dealing with this kind of experience. We need to talk about this. We need to raise the awareness.
Wow, that's very sobering.
And, further to that point, Tara, it's not so far away. This weekend, I had coffee with somebody who told me of a very good friend of theirs who did suicide, who was trans and did suicide.
Wow.
It's not theoretical. This is actual. This is happening.
Yeah, well, there's so many things that push people into those situations where they feel like they have no other out and life just seems so intolerable. And I can't even imagine what it would feel like to feel like that, because I haven't experienced that in my life, but I can guess that it would be terrible if someone chooses to die by suicide and, or consider it, forget about just dying, considering it as well. So,
well, one of the indicators that they point to is that feeling of isolation. So if we're presenting that this is unacceptable or outlawed, if there's no way of feeling connected or feeling that there's a safe space, we will feel isolated and we will feel overwhelmed by this.
Yeah. So I'm just pausing because it's such a hard thing to hear. But that's why we're here. So
it's a hard thing to hear. It's a hard thing to have to acknowledge. But again, it makes me think how we've become compliant if we don't speak up.
Absolutely. That,
it's so
I
easy
agree.
to say. It's so easy to say, well, it's not a fire in my backyard, so it doesn't really involve me. Could you imagine if we had a fire department that said, well, it's not my block, I'm just going to let it burn?
Yeah, exactly. It's interesting because when I was doing some of the preparations for this and to, some social media posts and stuff like that, like it did cross my mind is like, what will be the impact of even just posting it? You know what I mean? Because we hear about threats, even people who are allies to things as well, or speaking against current regimes, you know what I mean? But as we talked about just before we started recording this, it's so important to do it. So I just can't say it enough.
But you're absolutely right, Tara. And I'll admit it myself. I was kind of on the fence. How far do we go out and announce our position in this because of the possible repercussions or consequence to ourselves? So then the bullying tactic works. It makes everybody afraid to stand up and announce what is correct. How could I possibly go out afterwards in good consciousness thinking that I did not speak up? I did not advocate for what was right. It's not possible for me.
I agree. Me neither. Okay. So visibility is also important because it breaks down stereotypes and it gives the power of being recognized. As humans, one of the things we value is being recognized for who we are. And so that's another reason why visibility is important.
To that point, Tara, breaking the stereotypes and the visibility, so much of fear is based on the unknown. So I think about the people who are being aggressive right now to these people, and I wonder how much of it comes in their lack of awareness. How could we help them, in a sense, become educated, even though they may say that they're not interested in it, by raising the awareness, by making it somehow destigmatized or acceptable in any form, will counter that ignorance. We have to face their fear.
Well, hopefully some of what we talk about today will be helpful. People who are regular listeners maybe aren't aware of some of these things. And so hoping that this is one thing we can do. We're also going to be sharing a bunch of resources in the show notes that people can learn more about. But let's start with definitions, because I think this is an important thing that people talk about, because there's many components that make up our identity. We've talked about the acronym GSERD, which we're not going to go into, but we want to, because we have a lot to cover today, but I want to cover some of the main definitions that are relative to this discussion, because you'll often hear people use biological sex or sex assigned at birth as an argument that someone cannot truly be another gender because you can't change your genes. But this argument overlooks that gender is not determined by chromosomes alone. It's a complex interplay of biology, identity, culture, and lived experience. So putting even gender aside, we know that we are all different and we all grew up different and we have different cultures that impact us. So can this idea of gender. So let's talk about the categories. And I did an excellent training as part of being a positive space person in the government, where they kind of broke these down. And I thought it was really interesting. So biological sex. So biological sex is chromosomes, hormone levels, and reproductive anatomy. So those are those things that you're born with. People will say this is the reason, right? But even this isn't clear cut, as some people are born intersex, right? Mm-hmm. And so they don't fit into typical male. Right.
And then we have gender identity, which is how someone personally experiences and understands their gender. It may or may not align with the sex that they were assigned to at birth, but it's how they see themselves.
Absolutely. And then gender expression is different from identity, and it could match their gender identity, but it can be just how a person represents themselves outwardly. So how they dress, hairstyles, voice, and behavior. And your gender expression may not match your gender identity or your biological sex. These can all be different.
And then further to that is sexual orientation. It's completely separate from gender. It describes who someone is attracted to romantically or sexually.
Exactly. And then the one that we talk about a lot on this podcast is relational identity. So this is also a separate part of one's identity. So how one chooses to engage in relationships. So for example, monogamous or non-monogamous. So, and then the non-monogamous categories, polyamorous, open relationships, swinger, lifestyle, relationship anarchy, all those things. So there's a lot. And that's not even all of our identity. So those are just some parts of our identity.
Mm-hmm.
But
to that point, Tara, if I may, we're talking today about trans identity, trans rights, but how far reaching it is, this conversation about that. It's not just about this one consideration, but how it goes so far reaching, the idea that there is a repression of expression, of freedom of speech. So if they don't like your gender, if they don't like your identity, will it stop there? No, it'll go on beyond that. You're no longer allowed to express yourself in a multiple ways. So this affects everyone. This affects you. And we need to bring this awareness. I'm sorry that I keep getting on my soapbox. Actually, no, I'm not sorry. We need to talk about this, God damn it. We need to raise the awareness. You had better be on guard. They are coming.
Yeah, absolutely.
They're coming after our rights. We need to talk about this.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think the definition part is important part of the conversation, because I think people use these things to have harmful arguments that try to invalidate people, whether they're trans or otherwise. And so I think it's important to say that being transgender is not about denying biology. It's about recognizing that gender is more than just chromosomes. And science supports this. Studies in neuroscience, endocrinology, and psychology all indicate that gender identity is rooted in more than just anatomy. So there you go, science.
Yeah, but to that point, Tara, it often makes me wonder, these other people that we're talking about, these, I'll call them the aggressors, why are they so obsessed with what's in my pants or how I express myself?
Honestly, I mean, yeah. It's a puzzlement to me, because I don't get it myself, but people feel very strongly about this, and we're seeing the impacts of that, and it creates a harmful and unsafe environment for a lot of people.
It sure does. It makes me think back to that beautiful expression of live and let live, right? So if it's not of your interest, if it's not your jam, then fine. Focus your attention on elsewhere, but allow other people to have their own expression. My rights end where yours begin, and your rights end where mine begin. I don't encroach on yours. I allow you freedom of expression. If you're not violent or restricting towards other people, then have at it. we can agree to disagree. But when you start to bully people, threaten them, and take hostile action, we need to be talking about that and aware of it.
Yes.
It also makes me think, unless you were raised by a bigot of a grandmother, what would your grandmother say about your hateful attitude?
Mm-hmm.
Would you say this in front of her?
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about identity, inclusion, and allyship in the polyamorous community, because we do talk a lot about polyamory and non-monogamy on this podcast. So I think it's important to talk about what we can do as a community to be more inclusive and an ally. So one of the things I love about polyamory as an identity, relational identity, is that it's open. I find my experience has been that it's open to fluid identities and self-discovery. You know, that's happened for me personally, things I've experienced that I would have never experienced, but it can allow for expressions that may not be as welcome in other environments. That's not to say that it's welcome in all spaces, though, right?
You know, it makes me think of the position of privilege that I have being self-employed and being able to really announce myself in whichever way I might, my identity, my sexuality, my relating expression. And I do appreciate the privilege, but I also can consider what it's like for many people who don't feel comfortable announcing their relationship structure. I could only imagine what it's like to have to really hide who I am in other aspects as well. Again, why it's so important to be able to stand together in unity and announce ourselves. Yeah. And even if we don't identify that way, announce ourselves as safe havens and allies.
Yeah, so it's super important to have affirming relationships where people can be seen and heard. I think it's also important as a polyamorous community that we can break free from prescribed roles, gender roles, relationship norms, identity constraints. I mean, I think we do this a bit already, but there's always more we can do. I think it's also important to be aware of language, pronouns, and asking rather than assuming in fostering respect for people, and then creating safe and inclusive spaces, like you said, for trans and non-binary individuals. And I had the pleasure to attend such an event. The first time I attended something like that, it was at our local sex club in Toronto, Oasis Aqua Lounge, and they had a sapphic night. And you know, while I'm generally not in favor of dividing by gender, I think what was great about this was that it was for women and women identifying people. So it was a safe space for trans women to attend and participate in the events that night. So I thought that was pretty cool.
That is very cool.
Yeah. And I think, you know, as a polyamorous community, we can help to avoid cisnormic assumptions. So assuming one's gender identity based on how they dress or look. Another thing I know that happens sometimes, not necessarily in polyamorous communities, but something we can be aware of, especially if we're involved in lifestyle swinging things or even just dating multiple people, is being aware of fetishizing, and I can't say that word, around transgenders. Huh?
I think you just did.
Did I say it right? Okay.
Sure
or fetishization. I don't know. It's a bit of a mouthful, because I hear that can happen too, right? People are trans people are on dating apps and stuff like that, and then they meet people, and it's to fulfill a fetish. Now, that's not to say that if that person wants that and invites that, it's okay, right? You know, we don't yuck people's yum, but sometimes it can be unsafe for people.
Well, I think the issue that many people would have is that being fetishized, you are no longer seen as the individual, but simply as what you might fit into in the role as.
Exactly. And I think making sure we create space for trans and non-binary voices, and then avoiding tokenism. So meaningful inclusion versus performative allyship. So that's what we can do as polyamorous community. So let's jump into what's been going on in the world. And, you know, this is a bit sobering when we were putting this together. There's been a huge rise in anti-trans rhetoric and legislation around that, and some very systemic discrimination due to government policies and social attitudes. And so we're going to share some examples as a means of educating. These are not all of them, but some of the things that are going on.
Right. So healthcare restrictions, for example, many U.S. states, including Florida, Texas, and Tennessee, have passed laws restricting and outright banning gender-affirming healthcare for minors with some of also impacting adults by limiting insurance coverage or access to providers.
In the UK, the government is reducing access to puberty blockers for trans youth, making gender affirming care even harder to obtain.
And some previously seen as liberal countries, such as Hungary, have also made it more difficult for trans individuals to legally change their gender. And Hungary has apparently even made it, perhaps this year, that Pride will not be taking place.
Wow, that's big. That's a big thing.
It's in the wind.
Yeah, and I know that when we were doing some research for our upcoming trip in Canada, you don't have to put M or F as your gender, you can put an X. But the warning on the Canadian site was that some countries don't recognize that and won't accept a passport if it doesn't indicate M or F, which is really interesting.
Again, I'm not quite sure how my genital configuration is really relevant to the idea of being admitted into a country or not.
Yeah, agreed. So there's some new emerging educational policies, like a lot of stuff. I mean, we hear a lot being in Canada about the US, but in the US, some states have passed don't say gay laws that restrict discussions around gender identity and sexual orientation in schools, such as in Florida, and educators would even face penalties for acknowledging trans students' identities.
Can you imagine?
I know. School bathroom bans in multiple states prevent trans students from using restrooms that align with their gender identity. And this is a huge thing, it's a huge thing for kids, but also is happening in workplaces. And if there aren't all gender washrooms, you get into a situation where it doesn't feel safe, or you can't even use a bathroom. And I heard when I was doing that positive space training, some lived experience from a trans woman that, trans people have a tendency to have super high urinary tract infections because they're holding their bladders, or they get seriously dehydrated, which impacts their organs and stuff because they don't have a safe place to go to the bathroom. Even if they're allowed to use it, it doesn't feel safe because their people might call them out or that sort of thing. It's terrible.
And even in a country that I like to consider very liberal, like Canada, some provinces like New Brunswick and Saskatchewan, for example, have now required parental consent for students to change their pronouns in school, making it harder for trans youth to have their identities recognized safely. So it's not just in foreign lands, but it's happening right here in liberal places such as Canada.
And there's
so don't assume that your free speech will be protected here either. We have to voice our concern about this.
Yeah. There's sports bans, so sports and activities bans. So over 20 US states have enacted laws banning trans athletes from participating in sports teams that align with their gender identity. And World Athletics and FINA, the Global Swimming Federation, have introduced policies preventing trans women from competing in female categories in elite sports. Here in these elite sports, people say, well, they have an edge because of their chromosomes. Trans women's chromosomes are male, so they shouldn't be able to compete with other women. And it's just, a lot to say about that. And then we talked a bit about this already with respect to our trip, but legal recognition and documentation. So Nebraska, for example, recently stopped legally recognizing trans people altogether through an executive order, like they don't exist. I mean, I don't know if you heard even the US president's speech, his opening of Congress. I'm going to get that wrong, where he said that there's only two sexes, male and female. That's a pretty major statement by a political leader. Some countries, such as Russia, have banned gender marker changes on official documents, forcing trans individuals to keep IDs that do not reflect their gender. And then several US states have passed laws making it hard for trans people to update birth certificates and driver's license. I know here in Ontario, you can have your health card and your driver's license. You can have, I think there's 3 options. You can have MF or X, or maybe you can have O too, maybe just X. So it's a start. And then we talked a bit about bathrooms. So bathroom bans in places like Florida allow for the arrest of trans individuals using facilities that align with their gender identity. And then, of course, there's been rising hate crimes, a lot. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. These are just a few examples. that, these fear-based narratives that are pushing people back in the closet. And it's a threat. It makes it harder and harder for trans individuals to live safely and authentically. And I think that's important to speak out and to talk about these things. So that's a good segue into what can we do?
So things like everyday advocacy, right? So sharing our own pronouns when introducing ourselves by invitation to someone sharing theirs, right? We might be able to do that. When using someone's name, when we don't know or not assuming their gender identity based on how someone may appear or express themselves, and speaking up when someone misgenders or makes transphobic remarks or microaggressions.
You hear that statement, they can share their pronouns, but I know who I am and I don't need to. I've heard that before. And those are the kinds of microaggressions I think that are important to call out, and why it's important. Pronouns.
Right. As a therapist, it immediately makes me question or wonder what is so threatening to them about using somebody's chosen pronoun. How does it really impact them? What about it is so fearful?
Yeah, I that's another one I don't understand. And I had a conversation with somebody I know about this, but they were pretty standing firm. Like they said, well, if they want to share theirs, they can go ahead and do that, but I don't need to share mine. And I said, but do you understand how that then puts this person in a position where they're the only ones sharing their pronouns? And what does it hurt to put yours so everybody knows?
But Tara, to that point, I will side with the other person and say, okay, so you don't want to share your pronoun? Fine. But at least allow for this other person the freedom of their expression.
Oh, absolutely. They weren't saying anything against this, but it was a matter of wearing name tags for like an event. And so, they were getting all new name tags that had pronouns on them. And this person had an exception to that because they didn't want to put they didn't think they should have to put their pronouns on. And I was trying to make the point, and it's subtle, right? It's subtle. But like if only one person has their pronouns on it, it makes them stand out as different. And it doesn't hurt us to put our pronouns on like a name tag.
Right.
You know what I mean? That was my point.
I know what you mean. Yes. So another everyday aspect of advocacy is by being visible, by keeping the conversation like this conversation going, to raise the awareness, to keep it at the forefront and not accept their intimidations and make us want to shy away from things. If we are quiet, we are complacent.
Yeah, and I think that's why it's important to arm yourself with some information, because people who are against recognizing trans individuals will back it up with all the data and whatever science they think is out there. So I think, that's part of what we need to do as an ally, is to arm ourselves with information and other facts about identity and that sort of thing. So it seems crazy to have to do that, but I found myself in a situation talking to someone and they just like rhymed off a bunch of science and blah, blah, blah. And I didn't really have anything except that I don't feel like it's right, So to not recognize people for the gender identity they wish to have. Anyway, so that's that. So I think, encouraging inclusive language and practices in our everyday life and normalizing checking on people's pronouns and identities. And I think that was, part of like the introduction thing is a light way of doing that. Like, hi, I'm Tara. My pronouns are she, her, hers. What's your name? And then that invites them to share theirs as well. So advocacy in the workplace is another example of something you can do to be a better ally. So encouraging inclusive policies for trans employees. So bathroom access, correct name usage, gender affirming healthcare, calling out workplace bias when it happens, those sorts of things.
Well, you have, I believe the Ontario government also has something for positive space.
Yeah, you can be a positive space. I can't remember if it's called like an ambassador, positive space person. You take a special training, a full day training, and you have an identifier and your work location that says you're a positive space person, and somebody who needs to talk to somebody can do that. There's also a lot going on. I'm really excited. One of the projects I'm working on is related to allowing people to change their gender identity through self-service. So they don't have to put a form in and somebody has to enter it for them. So as part of that, we talked with some groups in the government about some of the work they're doing to help people transitioning. And so it's pretty exciting when you see that sort of stuff happening. But I think it needs to happen like a lot more in a lot of other workplaces and spaces. And so you can also support trans organizations. There's a lot of them. You can do volunteer work, you can donate, you can find out more about them. We're going to list them in some of them in the show notes, and feel free to add any others just by commenting in the podcast. And, you know, one of the other things is uplifting trans voices. So, you know, commenting with people's social handles. I'd love to follow them. I follow a lot of people, and I'd love to do that more as a way of uplifting voices. Did I miss anything?
Those are some very good points. I don't think we could cover everything, all of them, but those are some good points right there. But also to that, you know, it's really about learning, reading, and taking people to incorporate better understanding of their experience as well. But, you know, it seems to me, unfortunately, that at this point, there is this hostile environment where there is a threat, many threats coming, not only to trans people, but to, for example, gay people, polyamorous people, people who are not of your same religion. It breaks my heart. The US, I will cite them, when I was living there, and for many, many years, it was, and I don't know that it actually became or was, but the idea was that it was a melting pot, that people would be free to have their own expression and be able to. But really, it seemed as though it was an invitation to inclusion. There were bridges being made, hands extended. And today, we are more polarized than ever. And we are burning bridges. We are making huge voids. And we are so far from each other. Where is the appreciation for our brother and sister? Where is the learning and invitation to kind of make these inclusions? It saddens me.
It saddens me too. That's why we're here, and we hope people have gotten this far in the podcast and listened. And thank you very much for listening to us and allowing us to share this information with you. You know, today, when we're recording this, happens to be a Trans Day of Visibility, but it doesn't matter when you're listening to this. Just, you know, be a great ally and learn more, be visible, be inclusive, do everything you can do to create a safe environment, safe and welcoming and loving and inclusive environment for everybody. I think that's so important. And not take our own privilege for granted.
But rather use our privilege to help the underserved, to help other people whose rights may be affected right now. And again, you know, we might be in a place of privilege and security, but we might also be next on that list. It might be scary to stand up to that bully in the schoolyard, but when we come together and are unified and we stand up to that bully, they often cower and will go away.
Absolutely. That's what they tell us, right? When we were kids, stand up to the bully.
Well, you know, Tara, even in the worst case scenario, if that bully does come out with a big club, I'd rather be hit over the head with it than turn my back from it, thinking that I'm living in this world that doesn't really want me to be part of, or that I would want to be part of if it's going to be like that.
Absolutely. So we thank you again for listening. We encourage listeners to share their thoughts, experiences, or questions in the comments of the podcast. You can add any resources in there, links, and we can always update the show notes with them. There's lots of organizations out there. Some of the main ones are PFLAG and GLAD, and we'll make sure we include those in the show notes. And yeah, so many others. So we're very thankful for those organizations and the people that stand up and speak out, and, you know, would love for you to add your voices to that. So that's it for today. Thanks everyone for listening.
Thanks everyone. Thanks, Tara.
Thank you, babe. Thanks for listening to the Let's Talk Polyamory podcast with TNA. Don't forget to subscribe and give us some love on your favorite podcasting platform. You can check out the show notes for any of the links to the courses or information we talked about today. Thanks, and have a fantastic, sexy day.